from Europe to Korea. Why is this topic important? According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, said that more than 1/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions created by human activity can be attributed to the way we produce, process, and package food. These emissions are harmful to the sustainability of agriculture industry as well. The elevated levels of carbon dioxide are expected to lower levels of zinc, iron, and other important nutrients in crops and lands. Changes in the rainfall pattern will expose farmers to two dual risks from drought to flooding. Additionally, addressing with this problem would reduce operating costs in the industry as well. Dividing the food industry into three parts, let's first look at the first part, the production. The global food industry in the production stage contributes to 60% of biodiversity loss and land conversion and 30% of climate change. A study done in 2013 notes that raising animals for meat, poultry, and dairy products contributes to 57% of emissions linked to the food system. Processing resources to consumable foods also require huge amounts of energy and emissions. Most of it used in heating and cooling products such as cooking meat or maintaining a cold chain throughout the whole process. Last but not least, the consumption stage is responsible for a large amount of waste and emissions. As the global food system is becoming more globalized, transportation is responsible for large emissions. Wasted food products which go into landfills and rot produce methane, a global gas that is at least 28 times potent as the carbon dioxide. Let's take a deeper look at the status quo of Germany and Korea. Emissions from the agriculture in Germany has decreased by almost 18% since the 20th century, but emissions in the food industry are substantial. According to the Federal Ministry for the Environment, it said that one typical diet of German creates 1.75 tons of carbon dioxide per person a year in 2018. Different uses leads to different types of gases, some of them even more harmful. The nitrous oxide, the N2O, is emitted when manure and mineral nitrogen fertilizer is used on lands, and 1 ton of N2O is equivalent to 298 tons of carbon dioxide. In 2018, there were 26 million tons of N2O emissions. While meat consumption in Germany is decreasing, there is still a large amount of cattle being grown in Germany, and domestic consumption and imports of the fodder and large exports of these animal products all add up to the greenhouse gas emissions. Germany is also heavily involved in agricultural trade because 1/3 these outputs are going into exports, and this is adding the emissions from the distribution of goods. Then how about in Korea? The emissions of the farming industry in Korea account for 3.4% of the total emission. The majority of these emissions come from growing rice. Korea ranks high in the usage of pesticides and chemical fertilizers per hectare. The increased popularity of the fast delivery services as well as importing nearly a half of its total food supply means the Korea agri-food industry has large emissions from transportation. Meat consumption in Korea is also an important issue as the number of cattle being grown in Korea increases, and the emissions from the livestock sector has increased from 91,000 tons in the 2017 to 99,000 tons in the 2020. Plastic waste has become a huge problem with the boom of delivery during COVID-19. Producing these plastic and burning the waste leads to huge amounts of emissions that are related to the food industry. After pointing out the status quo of emissions in the food industry, now let's move on to our final part of our presentation, proposing the carbon neutrality blueprint. While building our carbon neutrality blueprint, we benchmarked the Net Zero Handbook created by the Food and Drink Foundations, which provides a practical guidance for all food and drink manufacturers that they can implement when making their own decarbonization roadmaps. We focus on the three main shareholders of the industry: the government, which provides subsidies and makes the regulations; farmers and companies, which produce, process, and distribute the goods; And last but not least, the consumers who are at the end of the supply chain. The Clean Energy Wire compared the moderate climate action with the ambitious climate action that could be taken in Germany. As shown on this picture, it is evident that when devising these future action plans, mitigation costs and time frames should also be considered as well. Then in Germany, what efforts have been put in by these each shareholders? In Germany, the Chancellor Angela Merkel's government in 2020 created the Commission for the Future of Agriculture. With the 2045, the climate neutrality vision, the German climate action law sets an emission budget for the agriculture sector of 56 million tons of CO2, down from the 70 million tons in 2020. The Federal Ministry of Food and Agriculture of Germany has also launched the Too Good for the Bin initiative to halve the volume of food waste by 2030. If the food waste were reduced by 50%, the global greenhouse gas emissions caused from this agri-food industry would be cut in Germany by 6 million tons of CO2 equivalent. The companies and consumers are also making efforts to decrease the carbon emission from the industry. Surplus is a supermarket in Berlin that sells food products that are near to be expired or misshapen up to prices at like 80% lower than its original price. This creates a win-win situation for the consumers as well and also help to reduce the food waste problem. Consumers can also make a change. For example, 34 cafeterias in the Berlin universities have made their menus primarily meat-free this October to suit the demand for more meat-free menus in their canteen, as well as also decrease the carbon emissions in this meat industry. Then what is the Korean's equivalent with this German 2045 climate neutrality vision? In 2020, the Korean government came up with the 2050 carbon neutral strategy as part of a long-term response to the climate change. The government plans to deploy smart farms and livestock shelters to minimize the input and increase automation. With these smart technologies in farm and fisheries, the government and farmers also have plans for implementing the low-carbon farming practices. The first implementation is to turn the manure to energy, which also reduces the emission. Another is using the solar energy and the geothermal heat pumps to mitigate the energy used in farms. They're also developing the environmental friendly fishing vessels that are powered by electricity and hydrogen. Then what should the government's short to middle term plan be? First, the government should devise an index to measure the detailed carbon emission from all parts of this industry value chain, from factories to transportation. They should also provide the adequate support and provide a better incentive scheme for farmers to make the change to a more sustainable farm. In the longer time frame, the Korean government should come up with policies to reduce a foreign dependency on food products, which will also help the Koreans economy, as well as reduce the emissions from transportation. They should also practice the sustainable farming practices by benchmarking the successful cases and making them applicable in Korea. Then what should the companies do? As shown on the picture, there are many aspects that can be discussed on the supply chain from manufacturing to transport and even processing. The companies are already making efforts to make their packaging greener and using these reusable containers, which is more sustainable and also reduce the cost in the long run. They're also implementing the methods to nudge consumers to make greener choices, such as opting of getting the single-use plastic on delivery. In the longer time frame, the companies should come up with ways to implement. Companies should make efforts to implement various laws and regulations, such as the recent removal of the vinyl wrappings on the plastic bottles. They should also strive to source these food ingredients, which will strengthen their resilience in the competition as well. Last but not least, the Korean consumers are also making various attempts to increase the carbon emission. Interest in the alternative and the meat substitutes has led to higher consumption, and a lot of consumers are taking part in the local food movement, such as gardening food in their own spaces to reduce the carbon footprint. But the one problem in Korea is that there is a lack of consumer need to reduce the food waste, such as buying near expiring food from the restaurant or misfit fruits and vegetables. Consumers could play a direct role by creating consumer-driven needs to reduce the food waste, as well as looking for more ways to reduce the plastic and food waste in their daily lives. Thank you for listening to our speech.